Good evening, everybody. Please go ahead and continue to serve yourself while I speak. We're doing this both in person and virtually, so I'm timing my introduction to the beginning of the Zoom session. I'm Gary Samore, Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. I want to thank all of you for attending, both in person and virtually. It's great to see so many people in person again. Unfortunately, we're not completely out of the woods, so I want to remind you to wear your masks when you're not eating. I want to say a few words about the Crown Center before turning things over to our moderator and the speakers. The Crown Center is your place on campus, not only for Middle East cuisine, but for multidisciplinary study of the modern Middle East, encompassing Israel, Iran, Turkey, and the Arab states. We teach and we study and we train scholars on the politics, economics, history, and anthropology of the region. And even on the most contentious issues, which the Middle East is famous for, our research motto is balanced and dispassionate. So naturally, our research and teaching includes the most pressing Middle East issues that dominate the headlines, like the Iranian nuclear issue or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's unavoidable. But we also believe in going beyond the headlines to explore the unappreciated issues and the overlooked trends in the region, hence the title of our session tonight. 4 scholars at the Crown Center are going to help us dive beneath the headlines. Dr. Mohammad Ataie, who's a junior research fellow, Professor Nader Habibi, the Henry J. Leir Professor of Economics of the Middle East, senior lecturer Raihan Ismail, who's on leave at the Crown Center from the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at Australian National University, and Dr. Muna Kareem, a junior research center at the Crown Center. So I hope tonight's session stimulates you to want to learn more about the Middle East. For students, please consider taking courses offered by our faculty. For anyone interested in the region, I encourage you to visit our webpage to get access to our publications and to sign up for our newsletter. And you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and watch previous seminars on our YouTube channel, including tonight's session, which will be broadcast. So I want to turn things over to David Siddhartha Patel, Senior Fellow at the Crown Center, who's going to moderate our panel discussion. David.
Thank you very much, Gary. So I'll be your air traffic controller for today. So usually at panels like this, at academic conferences, the way it works is you have 4 panelists. Each of them will drone on for about 20 minutes about their research, and only after that hour, really an hour and a half, because everyone goes over, the audience then gets to ask them questions. We're going to do something differently. What we're going to do is we're going to try to actually make this a conversation. Why? One, because we think it's more dynamic, but also because we want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what it's like in the Crown Center when we're talking to each other, sharing ideas, usually around our fantastic coffee and espresso machine, which is always stocked. But it'll give you a sense of what it's like to be in a center like the Crown Center. So what I've asked our 4 panelists to do is to just briefly, 2 minutes max, just give an introduction with an anecdote or a story about the main topic that they're going to address tonight, which may not be about their research. It may be something that's building off their research, or may just be an insight they know from their fieldwork or time spent in the region. And then I'll begin a conversation, hopefully between me and them, but also between them. And I encourage all of them to have a conversation about each other's topics up here with me. And then we'll open it up, and we should have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and just hand it off and ask Raihan to start.
Thank you so much, David. And hello, everyone. I want to thank the Crown Center and Gary for having me on board. I'm really excited to be here. So what I'll be looking at is social media influencers, particularly Western-based social media influencers who have traveled to the region. And I think it's really a fascinating trend when you're looking at social media influencers. And here I'm talking about Instagrammers, vloggers, as well as YouTubers who have taken the time to travel to the region and meet locals, eat local food. And what they've done is depict a flattering image of the region. And when we talk about the region, the Middle East, often we look at conflicts, or we hear about conflicts in the region, and news media outlets don't actually help to depict something more flattering of the region. But social media influencers, they've done a wonderful job in depicting a region that is fun, to travel, to visit, and so on. On the one hand, as I've said, some of them are so popular. They have 7.7 million followers. Someone like J.L. Faris, I think, is an American social media influencer. And they've done a wonderful job, showing that this is a great region. But on the other hand, so this is the question that perhaps we can talk about a bit more, they have been solicited by regimes in the region with terrible human rights records and so on, to travel to the region and demonstrate that the region is fine. In some cases, some would argue that the region or regimes in the region embark or engage in reputation laundering by using social media influencers. It's very similar to sports washing or art washing, for instance, where athletes, artists, and sports are used to actually demonstrate that regimes are, in many ways, have a positive image, and when actually they don't really have a positive image. So that's basically, is just less than 2 minutes, I hope.
Perfect.
Fantastic. So that's basically what we can discuss later as well. Thank you.
Mona?
If I continue with the Gulf region, I am someone who grew up in the Gulf. I think when I came to the States to study, I realized how much the Gulf region is marginalized within Middle East studies. And it was strange to me, considering how instrumental these Gulf states are, as oil economies, but also in relation to U.S. foreign policy. One obstacle was that I'm actually a literary scholar, so this is not really my area to shift Middle East studies when it comes to social sciences, but I use literature and cultures to think about the Gulf region in connection to, historically Persia and the Indian Ocean at large, and I do this by thinking, how can we put Arabic literature and all kind of artistic expressions from the region in conversation with ones made by migrants, stateless people, Afro-descendant people, displaced people who have come to the region for centuries, or built life there, So I think literature is one of those very rare few places where we can reimagine the Gulf against the official narrative and hegemony, and I'm hoping to do so throughout my time at Crown Center.
Fantastic. Nader?
Thank you. Since we are committed to be fair and balanced, we had two colleagues speaking about the Persian Gulf region. I'd like to now take you all with me to the Mediterranean, to the other side of the Middle East, and talk about something interesting that is happening now in recent years in that region. And that is the story of the discovery of natural gas in the Mediterranean, and how that discovery is really creating new cooperations, new relationships among the countries in the East Mediterranean. These are Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Cyprus, Jordan. And this is interesting because we know that Middle East is always known for tension and conflict, but now, because of the potential for everyone to benefit from the discovery and even export of the natural gas in the Mediterranean, we see a new tendency towards cooperation, negotiations, and new economic agreements in the region. You might be interested to know that in the first decade of the 21st century, we had oil flowing to Israel from Egypt, And now we have those same pipelines being used for Israel sending natural gas to Egypt for export to Europe. And I hope we could have an interesting conversation about the geopolitical implications of these developments in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. And now for a jet-lagged Mohammed, who just flew in from Iran yesterday.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I hope that my jet lag wouldn't interfere too much in our conversation today, especially right now it's around midnight in Tehran. So, so as Nader mentioned, when it comes to the coverage of the Middle East and Iran in the mainstream media in the US, there's lots of talk about conflict and tensions. I think usually one problem that I notice with the mainstream media coverage of the Middle East is that they tend to explain developments in the region in sectarian terms. For example, when it comes to the relationship between Iran, post-revolutionary Iran, and Syria, they usually talk about it as a sectarian alliance. The partnership started in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution, and the mainstream media tend to think that the Shia identity of Iran and the Alawite identity of the ruling regime, the president of Syria, Assad, is like the main cause of the alliance, which, in fact, ignores the complexities, historical complexities behind the alliance. So this is just one example, and we can talk about other examples as in our conversation. Or the way they talk about the relationship between Iran and different non-state actors that are part of the Iran's network of influence or the axis of resistance. Usually it's described as a top-to-bottom relationship, proxy relationship, which again ignores the historical complexities behind the relationship between Iran and these non-state actors, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Palestine.
Terrific. I think you all see the tremendous scope, the geographic range, but also topical range, disciplinary range of the things that are addressed at the Crown Center, both in our research and over coffee. So I want to start with Raihan. And let me just put this in some context, because I'm an old Gen Xer. Some of you in the audience I know are boomers. I saw this poll from July 2022 of 1,000 youths in the United States, ages 16 to 25. So there's 1,000 young people in the US. 37% of them want to become a social media influencer, and 1 in 4 of them plan to become a social media influencer. They see it as a career option. In fact, 20% of men in that poll saw social media influencer as the only career option available to them. And they estimated that the average salary of an influencer is between $75,000 and $100,000, which might be right, I don't know. But it'll give you a sense of how just incredibly large the pool of people in our own country who expect to be social media influencers is. And one avenue, for the students who I interact with, one avenue they see to become that is to travel in the region, just like I did right after I graduated, backpacking through the Middle East with the Lonely Planet guides in the late 90s. So, Raihan, tell us something about, you used the word solicited by regimes to rehabilitate their image. How does this work? Are regimes in the region reaching out to young people who studied in America or in Australia or in the West to come there? Are they monitoring people who've done trips? Are they latching on to them and contacting them once they're in the field? Is this being done by the ubiquitous intelligence agencies? Give us a sense of the nuts and bolts of how regimes are connecting with these people and the extent to which these influencers know that they're the ones being influenced to influence others.
So, great question. I know we've had this conversation. My daughter wants to be a YouTuber. So we have, a lot of work to do, I think. So there are 2 types of influencers, one could argue. And I think some researchers have done a lot of work in trying to understand how they operate. And you have the traditional influencers, and they are celebrities who have made, basically they've created a niche for themselves, so the musicians, they're artists, so they have talents. So they've used their talents to become influencers. But you also have social media influencers. And according to some research, social media influencers actually have more influence than traditional celebrities. And that's because they're seen as more authentic. People relate to them. People see what they're doing as something that they can connect with. And it's also possible for they themselves to actually become a social media influencer. And that's why they get a lot of, I think, opportunities to endorse brands, for example. So some of the social media influencers, Western-based social media influencers who have traveled to the Middle East, they become very popular, well-known, and some governments identify that these are popular social media influencers and therefore ask them to come and visit, all expenses paid for. So in the context of Saudi Arabia, for example, in 2019, they invited a number of social media influencers with huge followings to come to Saudi Arabia, take photos, take pictures, beautiful videos, and so on, to publicize these videos as part of Saudi Arabia's tourism industry. So they have, huge following, and governments identify them, and they're very popular in the region. Some of them are not as popular as others, but because of the fact that they've traveled to the region, they've gained a lot of popularity as well. So one of them is Doug Bernard. I watch Doug Bernard's videos all the time. It's really fun to watch. He visited Iraq. And of course, he wasn't solicited or approached by the Iraqi Foreign Ministry or the Iraqi government. But because the videos that he produced were brilliant, Iraqis loved the videos, people in the region loved the videos, the Iraqi Foreign Ministry decided to issue a statement praising Doug Bernard. But more importantly now, he is collaborating with local travel agents to invite and attract people from Australia, New Zealand, the US to actually travel to Iraq. So it's really interesting to see the dynamics, but also how these social media influencers operate in the region and how ruling authorities find there's an opportunity to actually collaborate with them.
Do we know, has the United Arab Emirates or other countries that are part of the Abraham Accords, have they been reaching out to Israeli social media influencers and getting them to come, or vice versa?
I think the UAE, they use, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not really looking at what, at social media influencers in the UAE, but they use local social media influencers to actually do that, because there are a number of local social media influencers who are very popular in the UAE. And they themselves have been endorsing Abrahamic Accords as well, saying that we want to travel to Israel and so on. So local social media influencers have been playing an important role in that sense in the context of the UAE.
So what would you say to any students here in the audience, Brandeis students, Brandeisians, who want to go to the Middle East and might be tempted of this? Is there anything they should be wary of?
Again, that's a very good question, but also a very tricky question. I think it presents an ethical dilemma. So when you work with ruling authorities in the region, you have to be aware as well that there are human rights violations, perhaps, when it comes to the activities of these governments. And if you work with these governments to promote Saudi Arabia as a country that is peaceful, expanding, liberalizing, socially liberalizing, you have to be aware that there are also human rights violations. We're talking about social liberalization, but not political liberalization. And I think recently the Saudi government sentenced an activist, a Saudi activist, for a tweet. She wasn't even an activist, a PhD student who was based in the UK, if I'm not mistaken, to 34 years in prison. So I think that is something that we probably have to think about, especially that we are part of a global community. We're very well interconnected as well. Do we have responsibility to say no? Do we have a responsibility to speak out when something like that happens? So I think some very important questions as well. And I think, as I've mentioned earlier, probably very similar to sports washing. And I know in the context of the US, more recently, we're looking at Live golf tournament, rivaling the PGA tours, if I'm not mistaken. And I know Greg Norman, who's a great Aussie was very much involved in that. So I think that raised, a number of ethical questions and ethical considerations as well when it comes to what do we do? Do we support, live tournament, or do we not? Do we take a stand, for instance?
So, Raihan, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, we have some people who use the social media, such as Twitter, anonymously to expose corruption or secrets of the ruling families. For example, there is a person named Mujahid in Saudi Arabia, or there is a person named Sadat Peker in Turkey who recently exposed a very important and really large-scale corruption. Can you categorize those as influencers in a way? What is their impact?
That's a very, very good question. Perhaps they're very influential within their countries, and especially not just the country, in the region as well. Mujtahid, for example, is followed by people not just in the region, not just in Saudi Arabia, but also abroad. You want to know what's happening in Saudi Arabia, follow So I think perhaps it has become social media in particular. And I know so many scholars have been working on social media and how social media initially was used as a tool for revolutionaries as well as activists to come together and mobilize support. But that has changed in the past few years as well, as ruling authorities and regimes in the region became aware that social media is actually an important tool. And I know some activists in particular who have said that they used to use social media, but now they're scared to use social media because they know that's how the states can actually monitor their activities. So it can be really quite problematic for activists in the region. But having said that, it's, some of them anonymously have become so influential and they know how to circumvent authorities. They know how to operate within limitations as well without being targeted by ruling authorities or state security apparatus. But again, that's a very good question. So in many ways, you can definitely consider them as influencers because of the fact that they're able to present information, highlight important issues that would actually make ruling families quite nervous. But having said that, I want to go back to, social media influencers traveling to the region. Some of them are doing a wonderful job. So I think this is where it becomes a bit difficult. So perhaps the main question is that when they get, when they receive funding from these governments, so maybe that's where, their activities are questionable. But when they're doing it, by collaborating with locals, maybe that's not something to be concerned about. I don't know, it's just my take on the issue.
Fascinating. Mona, your work speaks to a different type of transnationalism. We're not necessarily influencers going from the West to the region, but looking at communities within the region who are overlooked within the national cultures, within the national histories. So can you say something about transnational linkages between those communities in the Gulf and their relationship to the national community, especially the development of national histories that might leave them out?
Yeah, I don't know where to begin. But yeah, I mean, if we think about the Arab Gulf region, and I say Arab Gulf because even that region has been using this term of like the Arab Gulf is exceptional. It's not Arab because it's not republics, it's monarchies. But at the same time would deny its connections to all of Asia, especially the Indian subcontinent as well as Iran. So I was in my dissertation work, I was focusing on literature written in Arabic, and that meant necessarily that all these immigrants who make up in a country like the Emirates, 60% of the population are South Asians. You never see those immigrants speaking for themselves or writing their own stories, or and whatever portrayals are there are very flat and limited and problematic. So after my dissertation, I just I became interested in branching out and thinking about, okay, how do we overcome this? And of course, language was the main thing. You have all those populations in the past 70 years placed together because of oil, post-oil production. and discouraged from assimilating, or becoming part of the national body. Condemned, always disposed. You can only live there for maximum a decade, So your culture never makes it into national culture. So your best shot is to be this diasporic person who writes in English if you're highly educated, or you write in your mother tongues and like publish back home where you are also on the margin, right? Like in India, people are not very interested in novels about the Gulf, for example, but in the Gulf, people read them through translation, right? Because that's the space where it should be. So I really think of literature as, or this literary study as a way of imagining the Gulf in a more, ground to top way that hasn't been offered, whether in any field, and as a way of challenging this idea that the Gulf was born only when oil was born, like that is a thing that the regimes want us to believe, and want us to reproduce.
So is it counterintuitively perhaps empowering in some ways, not for these communities not to be part of the national discourse and being forced to tell their story and tell their history in a way that conforms with, say, the Kuwaiti narrative of how the state was formed? And along those lines, what are they able to address, or what topics are left out of those national histories that this perspective you're bringing allows us to look at and allows them to talk about?
Well, I'm really concerned about the silence because these people also happen to be the majority of the working classes in this region, So that is not just a random silence that just has to do with cultural differences. It's about, like, we have this mass population that we bring from abroad, exploit them and send them home, and we don't allow them to speak or partake or imagine or, engage in any way, or even call it home, like even something as simple as that, right? So for me, like, when I create this new cultural history of the Gulf, it's also about centering working class people, and for citizens of the Gulf who, by the way, like, a country like Saudi Arabia, there are thousands of political prisoners, and so people are, like, politically engaged. They are politically active. However, there hasn't been yet a moment where people imagine that a struggle for say, a better country must include immigrants too, must include stateless people too, It can't be just like citizens or regional populations.
I think slavery was a key topic that you addressed in your dissertation. Can you say something about how that was able to be addressed from this perspective, but say is left out or formulated in a particular way in the national histories?
Yeah, so with slavery, especially, like, because the Gulf are port cities, so that, so the Gulf has been a part of, like, slavery from West Africa, but also Indian Ocean, and usually, I mean, if you look, you will see that, for example, colonial archives have something about that history, but, like, in local cultures and histories, there is nothing of that except in novels. So I thought that was really interesting that only novels had to deal with this, and it's a very contemporary interest, let's say. But then I got to compare also, like, how does an Arab citizen woman of a middle-class family, and when I say Arab, I mean, I don't know, like, people have these classifications. Are you originally Ajami, or are you originally Zanzibari, right? So in that sense, when you look at these novels versus novels written by people who are descendants of these slaves, you see a radical difference in how these histories are approached. So you see, for example, that if you are middle class, you flatten all struggles to be like, oh, they are all the same and relatable, like we all suffer in a way. Only Arab men don't suffer, right? Versus when you see someone of an African descent, for example, you see that this is more than a political statement. This is about, like, documenting, engaging, critiquing, and also composing something that doesn't exist even.
Fascinating. Somebody's going to ask it, so I'll go ahead and ask it now. Can you recommend a few novels, if you want to get out of the pantheon that people who know the region might know about? Beyond that, what are some other novels you think are worth exploring, especially in translation, that people might be able to access?
I think that, like, because I'm limited to English translations, I will stick to two main titles. One has become very popular lately by Joe Al-Harithi, an Omani writer. She won the Man Booker Prize for it, and it talks about Oman's history of slavery in Zanzibar. And then you also have Temporary People by Deepak Unikrishnan. He's from Abu Dhabi, but originally from Kerala. And he wrote it in English, actually. And one more title maybe would be Saq al-Bamboo, the bamboo stock, which talks about immigrants, but also stateless people in Kuwait, and it's been translated into English. So I feel like they would make a good start, into the Gulf and its literature and culture.
Mona, may I ask you, which historical period do you cover or focus on? Because all the immigrants that have come to the Gulf because of oil have come after 1960s, but there has been a history of immigration even before then. Do you cover longer period than the contemporary period?
I will say I'm guided by the modern and contemporary novels that I encounter, because these novels are, like the novels that take on these issues are always 90s and after, so like this is very recent, what I'm studying. So I'm guided by the novels. I'm not like a historian. Don't want to be, but like as a literary scholar, I'm thinking more of how does this moment of like post-national help us think about exactly what you said, like that there is a history that's been erased, immigrations from Indian subcontinent and Persia to the Gulf and back has been happening for a millennia at least. But all of this is erased in what we learn through official histories. So when we study the present, we learn about the past as well,
So we'll come back, but I want to turn to Nader now. Nader, I'm going to push back a little bit. You painted a picture of how the discovery of gas in the Eastern Mediterranean is opening up possibilities for cooperation among all these states, that it's been marked by dialogue, by agreements, and that's puzzling, right? Your argument was that because there's potential for everyone to benefit, but we see lots of other instances where it's not just about everyone sharing the pie, it's about who gets what part of the pie. So why didn't the discovery of natural gas, especially in offshore locations, which can be contested everywhere, I think in the world where you see oil or gas offshore, it ends up leading to border disputes over what the angles should be and the details of the law of the sea. Why in this region has it led to what you would characterize as cooperation instead of more conflict and disagreement? Maybe these negotiations and agreements you're talking about are actually attempts to hedge off conflict or open disagreement.
Well, in my opening statement, I was just trying to be optimistic. The reality is more complex than that. There are disputes, there are some examples of cooperation, but there are also multiple disputes in the region. And I would say, given this small area of East Mediterranean, it has more of the disputes relative to other offshore discoveries. To give you an example, we have a dispute between Israel and Lebanon on a small region that they both claim should be their waters. We have another dispute between Turkey and Cyprus because of the northern Cyprus region. So those are two important disputes that I think would influence how the natural gas in this East Mediterranean would be developed, because you have an option of developing and exporting these in cooperation, but if there are tensions and if long-term agreements among major players, these countries, prove to be difficult, then you would see a different pattern of development where national focus would become more important, and any kind of cooperation would be short-term transactional. But what I see is that because, especially now, because of the Ukraine and the fact that Europe needs a lot of gas, and they cannot no longer count on Russian gas, suddenly the East Mediterranean has become more important. And we see many important politicians from EU, even the United States, going to the region, trying to resolve the disputes so that the natural gas resources of the region can be developed and possibly exported as soon as possible, because this winter Europe needs gas, and there is a potential that some of the Middle Eastern gas can be exported to Europe, even though any kind of development has to be long-term in order to really develop efficient pipelines to Europe from the Middle East.
So pipelines are a different type of infrastructure than oil fields, right?
Correct.
They're perhaps more difficult to protect, more vulnerable in some ways. What new vulnerabilities would the development, wide-scale development of natural gas pipelines as part of this discovery and exploitation process, what new vulnerabilities would it open up, especially in areas that aren't centrally controlled by the governments or for non-state actors to exploit?
Well, the security of those pipelines would be a major challenge. Just to give you an example, during the period that, right after the Arab Spring, the pipelines that connect Egypt and Israel for oil or for natural gas came under attack repeatedly for a couple of years. And now in the Mediterranean, if there is no multi-country agreement, the contesting countries, some of them might resort to acts of terror against these pipelines. To give you an example, the dispute between Israel and Lebanon over the recent discoveries in disputed waters, we have already seen a demonstration of a threat by Hezbollah by sending a drone towards that area simply to demonstrate that they can send a drone or create some kind of security vulnerability if Israel develops that unilaterally. And one of the reasons that, despite the fact that gas has been discovered and is being developed for nearly 10 years, we haven't seen a significant major pipeline. One of the reasons for that is the concern about security issues. That's why we might see alternatives being developed that are less vulnerable to these kinds of threats.
You mentioned Hezbollah, so that's a nice segue, I think, to Mohammed's topic, which is about this axis of resistance that people have linked to Iran and its networks of so-called proxies throughout the region. I think that's a term that we're going to talk about. I think that the common narrative is that Iran has developed this network primarily after 2003, the invasion of Iraq, and after 2010-11, the Arab uprisings. You date it to a much earlier period. Can you say something about that durability of Iran and its axis of resistance, where it came from, and why it's been so durable?
Thank you, David. So, in one sense, even when we talk about the durability of the axis or the Iran's role in the region, I think we should go back even further to the time of the Shah in the 50s. I mean, the common thinking is that, Iran got involved in Lebanon. It's just one example after the revolution. But in fact, the Shah and the Savak, which was Iran's intelligence, was deeply involved in Lebanon in the 50s. And the most important officials of the Savak were stationed in Lebanon at the time. Mansour Qadar, he was a famous officer in Savak. So going back to the question about the axis, I think we should see the origin of the axis in the Iranian Revolution. In one sense, the axis of resistance, or which is Iran's network of influence in the region, has ideological roots in the pan-Islamic third-worldist ideas of the Iranian Revolution that advocated for the unity of the Muslim community and the downtrodden across the globe against imperialism and for the cause of the Palestine. Also, a couple of important events in the 1980s were crucial in the formation of the Axis. The 1980 invasion of Iran by Iraq under Saddam Hussein that ignited a war that lasted for 8 years. And then in 1982, the invasion of Lebanon by Israel. These two events were extremely important in the formation of the partnership between Syria and Iran. These two countries came together to counter the expansionist policies of Israel and also Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Over the course of time, the Axis began to include other actors, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Palestine. And later, after 2003, some Iraqi factions, and after the Arab Spring, the Ansarullah in Yemen. So the Axis has been going through different stages. 2003 was an important watershed for the Axis. The ouster of Saddam Hussein had a major unintended consequence that allowed Iran to project its influence into Iraq, become a major player, or perhaps the most influential player in Iraq. And it brought Iran closer to Syria and their allies in Lebanon and Palestine on a territorial level. I mean, after that, people have started talking about the formation of a land corridor all the way from Tehran to Beirut. All the same, what happened after 2003 sparked fears among many Arab leaders. For example, the Jordanian king began talk about the formation of this Shiite crescent that stretched from Tehran to Beirut. And also there were, like, after 2003, sectarian violence in Iraq. So I think what happened after 2003 gave this impression that the Axis was developing along with this age-old Shi'i-Sunni divide in the region. But as I said, the Axis has roots in not just pan-Shia ideas of the revolution, also in its pan-Islamic ideas, third worldist and liberationist ideas. And also it contains non-Shi'i actors like Hamas or the Islamic Jihad in Palestine, who are Sunni.
So, I don't know if he's Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, or I guess he's former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett. He compared the relationship between Iran, between Tehran and these so-called proxies, he described as an octopus, right? And he said that they're going to hit the octopus in the head. What do you think of that analogy?
So I think that analogy means that, you know, Iran is the head, and then there are tentacles across the region. For example, Hamas, Hezbollah, or Ansarullah. I think the problem with the analogy is that they think that Tehran has like full control, much control over these so-called proxies. I think in one sense, even it gives too much credit to Iran. When you read the pro-government media in Iran, when they want to praise the supreme leader in Iran, they call him Wali-Amr, which is like the guardian of all the Muslims. But in the reality is that Iran's control over these non-state actors is always facing many challenges. It's not like a full control. There is no command-control relationship or top-to-bottom relationship between Iran and these non-state actors. These actors are socially, culturally, and politically rooted in their respective national contexts, and in many cases, Iran has to go through lots of efforts and negotiations to bring these actors in line with Iran's policies. I think I should give you a couple of examples to illuminate my point. So in 2006, Hamas ran for election, And at the time, I remember there were deep reservations in Iran about Hamas becoming involved in the political process. Or in 2015, Ansarullah, or the Houthi movement in Yemen, attacked and occupied the city of Aden in southern Yemen. And that was despite of the concerns and even the objections of within the IRGC. They were absolutely against that operation. Or like another famous example is that Hamas sided with the uprising in Syria, and like that made really Iran's leader really unhappy. That came as a major challenge to Iran's Palestine policy. And of course, Iran and the IRGC held extensive talks and negotiations with Hamas leaders, but they were not successful. And eventually, Hamas and Syria got into major troubles. So what I'm saying is that, unlike what the former Israeli prime minister said, there is no head and tentacles. In fact, there are different heads within the axis, and that's what actually that makes the axis impactful and versatile.
Mohammad, you should write I have a 6-year-old son, so he doesn't want to be a YouTuber yet, but we watch a lot of nature videos and octonauts. He loves them. Octopuses actually have brains in each tentacle. Yeah. So you can write a piece that Bennett was right, but he was also wrong because he misunderstood the nature of octopi. Yeah. So there's a publication here, national interest. So we have lots of time for Q&A, and I really want to open up the conversation both to our audience here on Brandeis's campus, but also to our virtual audience. On Zoom, there's a Q&A button, and if you enter your questions via the Q&A feature, I should be able to access them, the miracle of modern technology. And so what I'd like to do is open it up, both for the people in the audience to ask questions of our panelists, but also our panelists to ask questions of each other. So we also have a microphone here, so feel free to come on up to the microphone. And in Crown Center tradition, I'm going to give first priority to students. Come on up.
You have to come to the microphone. I don't know if he
doesn't know you.
Yeah, I'm getting different questions. I need to figure out how to do this. Oh, this is the chat. Okay. We're all students around the table.
So thank you so much for a great panel so far. I have a question for Raihan and for Mohammad, if I could. So I'm excited to be part of the Crown Center this year, and if we were sitting around a table and you were talking about all this stuff, the question that I would have for both of you goes to effectiveness. Because when I think about both the things you're talking about, one of the questions that comes in my head is, are these policies actually working? So when you take, for example, the social media stuff that you're talking about, Raihan, right? I think about the ad exec who said, I'm not sure what my ad budget is doing. I think half of it's working, half of it's not. I'm not sure which half is working. When I think about the Saudi government saying, okay, we're going to fund these influencers, et cetera, their path of how this is going to be effective, I guess, is some general, okay, we see beautiful deserts or great food or happy people, and now the Saudi brand is just going to be better. It's not just going to be Mecca and oil. It's going to be happy people and something. But I guess my question is, do we have good knowledge, or what's your sense of whether this actually changes people's minds? And is the story that the Saudi government wants kind of just take your focus away from politics and oil and put it on people and happiness and visiting? Or is it also kind of an indirect, hey, they'll think this way, and then that will also change their view of our politics? Because I could see it going either way. I could see it being, yes, we have a more positive Saudi brand, and then that makes more positive views here. Or I could see, okay, lots of people start to visit Saudi, and then they start to see things that they don't like about Saudi, and maybe that shines a light like Amnesty International does, and they don't like that. So I'd love your thoughts just on how effective actually is this stuff, because we're talking about it like, okay, this is a hot new thing and it's happening, but I'm not sure it's going to work the way they want it to. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then Mohammad, not the same question, but also an effectiveness one. It's just taken as doctrine by Raisi, by all these leaders from Iran, from the Republican Guards, that this policy is the way to go. This is how Iran establishes deterrence, gets influence, etc. But when I look at Iran's foreign policy, I see that this approach works pretty well when there's an ongoing civil war insurgency that can plug into, right? Look at the dates you mentioned, right? These big wars, that allows them to build up these groups, train them, get influence. When it comes time to state build, to effectively govern, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Lebanon, these groups seem to fail again and again, and also are not beloved by that many of the people there when they have to govern. And so I guess my question is this a strategy that's really limited to certain contexts, or is it actually effective more broadly to build influence? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. That's an excellent question, and I think it's not going to be an easy question to answer. Mainly because we don't really have enough information. I don't have enough information on whether or not the Saudi government strategy is working. But what I can say is that it distracts from certain issues, particularly controversial issues. And if you look at social media influencers, they have a huge following, as I've mentioned earlier, and with the increasing social media consumption, they are appealing to people who don't actually watch traditional news outlets. And I think in many ways, when you look at the comments, people are saying that, look at Saudi Arabia, you have concerts, it's amazing, it's great. So you have great singers, you have international DJs, and I think, what is it called, raves? Is that what it's called? Yeah. Sorry, I'm demonstrating my ignorance. My daughter will tell me off. But raves, for instance, and you do have people receiving and reciprocating and basically saying that, wow, this is really exciting, this is new Saudi Arabia. So maybe on the one hand, it does really destabilize the narratives that the Saudi government wants, is opening up. It's quite repressive, so it destabilizes that narrative. It's showing that they're socially liberalizing, and it is actually fun. It is happening in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, you do have particularly activists who are based in Western societies who are puncturing that narrative and destabilizing that narrative again, basically saying, look, it sounds great, but it's not that wonderful when you're looking at human rights violations. They continue to remind Western audiences in particular, because when you look at the Saudi government, they really want to appeal to Western audiences, particularly Mohammed ibn Salman. And activists who are based abroad are the ones who are actually destabilizing that narrative. And I think many would argue that's one of the reasons why Jamal Khashoggi was targeted, because he was so forceful and effective in Washington. The fact that he was able to actually challenge Saudi government's, brand image or whatever, really made him really quite a threat to the Saudi government. I think we were talking about this yesterday as well, Mona, where we talked about exiles and people from the region traveling to Western societies and campaigning from abroad. And now in countries in the region, particularly countries that engage in extreme authoritarianism, the best tactic is to actually keep them at home. Before you would think that, yep, just leave, you're causing so much issues for us, but now it's like, no, don't travel. Stay at home, because we know that you can be an effective force abroad. So I hope I've answered your question. I don't think it's going to be easy to answer that question. I think a lot of surveys and data collection would probably be needed to be able to answer that question effectively. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you very much for the great question. As you said, it seems that Iran has been successful under the leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei to create deterrence against real and perceived enemies in the region through the axis of resistance. You can see many examples, like Iraq. One time Iraq was a major threat to Iran and was invaded by Iraq under Saddam Hussein, but now Iran is a major player. Iran is a major player in Iraq. Or in Lebanon, through Hezbollah, Iran is exerting major influence in the political situation in Lebanon. I think when you look at the way that Iran's policies are working in the region, in these countries, you can say Iran has been usually a good spoiler, like when like they want to prevent, for example, the U.S. to adopt certain policies concerning Iraq or do certain things in Lebanon. Iran is able to spoil all those policies through, for example, Hezbollah or Hashd al-Shaabi in Iraq. But when it comes to state building and governance, I think Iran is not a good player. And I mean, the examples are again out there. Look at Lebanon. I mean, it's going through really major economic and political crisis. I don't want to say that Iran is responsible for that, or solely responsible for that. For example, in Lebanon, I mean, the sectarian-based political system is suffering from many problems going back to the time of the French mandate. But because of Hezbollah's influence in the country, I think many people held Hezbollah and Iran responsible for the situation. And I don't think Iran can really like help Lebanon or Iraq to solve their major economic or political problems, simply because Iran's regional policies are not defined to to provide a good example for governance and help those countries to leave those the bad the troubles in their economic and political situation. So as you said, yeah, it has been effective in terms of creating deterrence, but not effective in terms of governance.
Well, to be fair, state building is hard, as the Americans have found out in numerous places. So it's unclear Iran is worse at it than other countries.
Yeah, and the irony is that Iran, at one point, entered into cooperation with the U.S. over Iraq. I mean, Iran was happy that the U.S. ousted Saddam Hussein, and now somehow Iran has inherited this, again, sectarian system in Iraq. And there is an inherent problem with that system that Iran wants to make working, but it seems that Iran is stuck in Iraq and its current political situation.
So I have a question first about the literature in the Gulf, which is fascinating. You're looking at. I'm interested in the literature in the Gulf. And it seems like you're looking at literature that is giving voice to the voiceless. And I'm curious whether you find there's a different voice expressed by men versus women in the Gulf. Do they have a very different perspective on their position? And then one question about the social media. So is the social media, these influencers, is it primarily in the language of English? Or do you see the Saudi government also courting Chinese or French or German, or is this primarily an American thing they're trying to get to shape American experience? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if we take the example of slavery in novels, one chapter of my book focuses on how slavery has been treated in contemporary novels. And I make this argument, which I came about because I translated Octavia Butler's Kindred into Arabic, and I saw similarities in what is called in African American studies neo-slave narrative, which, it has for example, diaries, of an escaped slave, imagining escaping slavery, and also how do you embed your people's history and culture in context of oppression or a history of oppression. So while translating this novel, I started to see the similarities to Arabic novels, especially ones written by Afro-Arab writers, if we can use this label. And in reading one of the novels, I noticed that, which is a really wonderful novel written by Baraka Sakin. He's a Sudanese writer, Abdulaziz Baraka Sakin, and it focuses specifically on Zanzibar, and it even portrays the Omani Sultan, and he uses a lot of history material Al-Amira Salma bint Saeed, who escapes with a German Orientalist and marries him. She's really canonical in that period. So he uses her own memoir, which like depicts all the slaves in the palace, you know, in racial, like not only racist, but also as like these hyper rapists, right? Like this is hypersexual rapist, you know. So he uses that history material to create a fictional novel. And while you're reading the novel, you see also like, sadly, there is the failure of the male author, which is, it turns into like this revenge rape against like the princess, you know. So even though he makes this critical historical piece that tackles that, you know, forgotten history, he couldn't help but by the end, you know, show like that sexist notion that the subaltern takes revenge by raping, you know, like the masters or let's say the mistress, right? Like, and so yeah, and I think instead of canceling or judging such novel, I like to see what is critical about it, while at the same time saying like, yeah, I mean, you failed there, you're a man. I hope next generation does a better job. So that's the example that comes to my mind. Thank you.
Yeah, I've seen East Asian social media influencers as well as part of the 2019 tour, but I don't know to what extent that's actually pervasive. So not just English-based or Western-based social media influencers, but others as well have been solicited. Yeah.
Thank you for the great panel. I actually have a question, but before that, I just want to make an observation. Nader, you said that the gas field, you spoke about the video that Hezbollah published. I mean, as I understand it, the gas field is actually in contested waters, right? That's according to Haaretz as well, the Israeli newspaper. And so it's not really just like Hezbollah trying to just simply, you know, fly a drone and show that they have military powers. They're actually trying to say that this gas field is in contested water, and Israel is claiming it as for itself, right? So they're trying to make a larger point, I think. So I think it's like perhaps too simplifying to say, you know, that this is just, you know, they're just like terror attacks, right? It's a bit of a blanket term to use. So the other question, again, on the gas field front is, you know, you spoke about how important it is and how it's been bringing different countries to the negotiating table for the first time and so on. I wonder where the Palestinian share in that gas. Do Palestinians have a share in that gas? Because as far as I understand it, again, in Gaza, for example, people receive only 4 to 6 hours of electricity per day. So where do Palestinians stand in this sort of, you know, gas and peace narrative? The last thing I want to say, I think, you know, Mohammed, you make a great point about the differences between different countries and different like Islamic governments, and I think that this needs emphasizing that Hamas is not the same as Saudi Arabia. I think in one of the previous questions, it was like just lumped together with like, you know, Hamas and Saudi Arabia as if they're like the same thing. That is obviously not the case. And so I wonder if you can like make maybe that distinction clear as to what, you know, the difference is between, for example, Hamas as a sort of a government in an occupied territory versus Saudi Arabia, which is a large and rich monarchy. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I start? Okay. So, with respect to Hezbollah, I didn't say that was an act of terror. I said this was a threat that was demonstrated. And Hezbollah is not the only one who has said, if you do not resolve this dispute, we will try to prevent you from benefiting from it. Turkey has made the same threat, by the way, with respect to Cyprus and the development of oil fields around them. Use of military threat is one of the things that the states resort to. It's not an uncommon thing, even non-state groups such as Hezbollah. So this is part of the negotiation posture to demonstrate that we are serious. Do not ignore us and go ahead and develop that particular gas field, the Karesh gas field, which lies in that disputed part of the Mediterranean land between the two countries. With respect to Palestinian share, Palestinians have not been involved as a party to any of the negotiations because the Israelis do not allow them to participate. And as far as receiving a share of the gas, there is some report that Israel has been selling part of the gas that it is producing from those two major fields to Jordan. Some of it is being sold to Palestinians. Of course, it's sold, not that they are simply giving it to them. And of course, now they are sending some of it to Egypt for exports. As far as the impact of this discovery on Palestinians, some of the countries that have been vocal in their support for Palestine are now in need of Israeli gas and also in need of those cooperations for transferring the gas to Europe. So we see some actually change in politics, in postures. For example, Cyprus, for a long time, has been a pro-Palestinian state, but recently Cyprus has reversed that position. We know that the Europeans have initiated a number of sanctions against Israel, but in the immediate future, next few months, they desperately would need the gas that Israel can send them through Egypt. So then I'm not sure how they might modify their posture because of their need to Israeli gas. So in a way, suddenly Israel has become an important economic player, and we might see some kind of change in the postures of some of the beneficiaries towards Palestine because of this issue.
So thank you for the great questions. Actually, about Palestinians, I think actually they're deeply present in this conflict. I was listening a while ago to a speech by Nasrallah. He was talking about the
Hezbollah leader, Nasrallah.
Yeah, Hezbollah's leader. And he was saying, this is not even an Israeli gas. I mean, according to him, it is a Palestinian, gas resources. So I think Palestinians are looking carefully what Hezbollah is doing and learning from that. I mean, Hezbollah has been a major example for Palestinians and other liberation movements that you can obtain your rights through resistance. So I think my impression is they're carefully watching what's happening in the Mediterranean Sea, and I guess that the Israeli officials must be really concerned about that. The question about Hamas and Saudi Arabia, of course, they're very different. I mean, on an ideological level, Hamas is leaned towards the Muslim Brotherhood, and for that, it has been in lots of conflict with the Saudi Arabia government, and especially we saw that during the Arab Spring, that tension became really serious as Saudi officials has put a number of Hamas activists in the kingdom in jail. So there is difference in that sense, and also, I mean, obviously Hamas is fighting for the liberation of land of Palestine. So, and we know that Saudi is standing historically on the question of the Israeli-Palestine.
I have a question for Raihan, and then a question also that I see as a point of commonality between Raihan and Mona's work. So first for Raihan, I was wondering for your scope, if you're primarily looking at English-speaking influencers, and if you see a relationship to Arabic-speaking influencers as well. I've noticed just anecdotally that some of the consumption of Arabic-speaking influencers, those people are based in places like California. And if there's anything that you have to comment about those kinds of relationships to geographic and national borders as well. And then for both you and Mona, I was wondering if you have any comments also on circulation and audience with literature and with these influencers. One thought that I was thinking about when you were recommending some books, Mona, was with temporary people. I just recently heard from somebody in the Emirates, actually in Abu Dhabi, that temporary people is in much higher circulation outside of the Emirates than there. And so if you have any thoughts or comments on that, I'd be very interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's a fascinating link. I'm not really looking at that specifically, but I'm aware some of the American social media influencers who are collaborating with news outlets in the region. So someone, what's her name? Dear Eileen, I think. So she's based in California. No, better not say that. People can Google these days, and I don't want to give people the wrong information. But I think she's really popular as well, and visited and traveled to the region. I must say it's a pet project of mine. So this is not really the main research that I do, but I think it's I find this fascinating and something that I'm really hoping to be able to develop into a journal article, because I think there's so much to explore there. But thank you so much, because I think that's an interesting link.
Yeah, actually, like the last part of my work is about exactly this literary economies. What is it? Like putting things in perspective. So like many of these novels, even like the most circulating ones that won awards. Like I'm not gonna give the example of the one that won the Man Booker, because that's a different case. Many translations. But the ones that won the so-called Arabic Booker, for example, we're talking about like thousands of copies. It's not really much, And we're talking also about, of course, we can't count how many pirated copies. That would be wonderful if we can count this. I read pirated books, living in the States without, access to Arabic books, the latest ones. So there is that question. But I also want to bring attention to something else that is, like I was reading this like survey or statistics about U.S. publishing that just came out 2 days ago.
Oh.
At least 90% of the books don't sell more than 100 copies? 90% of books in the U.S.
A dozen.
Right?
It was like 70% or so don't sell more than a dozen copies.
Yeah.
So depressing.
So it's like all this commodity on the shelf that makes you feel like, oh, Americans read, but do they? It's like, so the same thing in the Gulf, and I put this at the end of my study because I like to place things in context and be like, yeah, I understand absolutely the limitations of thinking about literature, and I always treat literature as a fictional space. It's a fictional space to think of, a utopia, I guess, in some way. Like how would have this region looked in its history, in an alternative world.
So we have a question an anonymous question from one of our online viewers, and it connects not necessarily, Raihan, with what you were talking about here today, but with your larger work on the Gulf, but also with Mona's work. With the growing use of social media, influencers, and so on, what can we say about the political culture that is developing in the Gulf region? In some of these countries, are people becoming more conscious about their role as a citizen in the society, in their relationship with the state? Big question.
Want to go first, or? Yeah, I really feel like, people in the Gulf get a bad reputation for not being, politically engaged or conscious. How do you really measure these attitudes? I think people really undermine. I feel like also we don't have the literature that documents people's resistance and whatever political movements they've had, as much as, as I began this evening, I was saying that, yeah, like the Gulf is overlooked in academic production, and this is only in the States. Imagine in other languages, and imagine in Arabic as well. Centers and peripheries is not something that we can deny. So I love it when I find historians or social scientists and others who document, create that history or historicize, the people's struggle. And I would say definitely the Arab Spring has been a mark, you know, like for people to start to think that, oh, we have agency, you know, we do have a say, we can dream, we can engage, you know. And I felt it more so in a country like Kuwait, where after the Gulf War, people became very anti-Arab, you know, like they had this attitude that we are Americanized, like the Arabs betrayed us, whatever. And then after the Arab Spring, suddenly everyone was like, oh, we're Arabs, you know, and like found their context again, you know. So definitely more engagement, and, you know, I feel like even despite all the oppression, people are very much politically engaged.
Oh, no, I was going to say I agree with everything you've said. I think it was beautifully put. I think I find it, you know, I completely agree with you in terms of people in the region, in the Gulf, having agency, and I think that's often overlooked as well. And I think what's really fascinating is the way they work around limitations, particularly when dealing with repression and so on. I think that's fascinating in terms of literature, but also artists in the region, and I completely agree with you, Mona.
So, are there any final questions? Because before then, come on up. I've warned my my panelists in the past, but what I'm going to do is we did this not last year. The last time we did this, this was a fantastic question. I asked each of them to say something. What do you know now? What do we think we know now that you wish you had known when you started studying the region? So whenever that was, what do you wish you knew then that we think we know now? And the responses to this question have always been all over the map. So I'm warning you again. I'm going to ask you that before the evening concludes.
Yeah. Recently, Turkey and Israel have recently normalized relations and have exchanged ambassadors. During the 1990s, actually, the relationship was, was blossoming. Both countries actually established a strategic partnership, which entailed strategic cooperation, military training, as well as joint maneuvers. And Israel also sold a large amount of weapon systems to Turkey. But everything ended with the Mavi Marmara incident, and even we can go back to the 2009 Operation Cast Lead. Do you believe that, given the new circumstances on the ground, Turkey and Israel relations could, the strategic partnership that was established during the 1990s could be reestablished?
Should I?
Address probably perhaps to Nader.
Yes. First of all, Turkey is trying to reestablish relations with Israel now, and not just with Israel. After the Arab Spring, Turkey's relations deteriorated with many Arab countries, and because of the Palestinian issue, also tensions with Israel. But now, Erdogan is trying to improve relations with all countries. Now, the natural gas issue, I think, is giving an added incentive both to Israel and to Turkey to possibly resolve their any kind of tensions that they have and normalize relations at a faster pace. Because one of the options for transferring natural gas to Europe for Israel is to send it through Mediterranean to Turkey, and Turkey already has pipelines for transferring it there. So that's an incentive. The other incentive for Turkey is that in order to improve their relations with the United States and influence U.S. policy, they try to always do that partly through their connections with Israel, because they perceive that Israel has significant influence in Turkey. I think we are moving towards normalization. It already began last year, and depending on what happens in Turkish politics, I think we are going in that direction. Yes, I think you're asking whether they will go back to the strategic relation that existed in 1990s and before Erdogan. I don't think they will go towards that kind of alliance against the Arab world. That was primarily NATO, Israel, Turkey, in that sense, because Turkey now has established strong relations with Arab countries, especially in the Persian Gulf with the oil exporters. And they rely on investments from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and now they are trying to restore their relations with Egypt because Egypt is an important market for them. Therefore, I don't think they would go into a strategic relationship against others, but they would try to normalize and expand economic relations to whatever capacity possible.
So I'm not going to... Oh, go, please.
Thank you for this great panel. My question was for Mona. I think your research is a part of this emerging interest in the discussions around race and racism in the non-Western context. I was wondering if you have actually encountered any kind of particularities that can inform us about the different genealogies of racism emerging in the region, especially which has become like apparent with the refugee crisis in many of these countries that are now turning these regions and subjects into kind of laboratories of their own particular context of racism. Could you see any kind of like different narratives of racism that was not quite like Western, but it wasn't that much authentic in itself?
Yeah. Thank you. I noticed it in different contexts. Like, for example, there's been some writing about like the oil camps, especially the American oil camps that were, in the Arab Gulf back in the 40s and 50s, and how the Americans would like impose their own racial code on these camps and separate like the Arabs from, like the Americans and later the South Asians as well. It was that kind of separation continued on in these camps, even beyond like after the Americans left, and nobody really questioned it in that sense, And sometimes there were failures, by even the resistant movements, the Arab nationalist ones that happened, to be like, yeah, we don't want these non-Arab workers, like this is entirely an Arab struggle, They didn't foresee that this region will continue to have immigrants, This is not just a temporary thing that happened. One mention, I can't remember the book exactly, but there was one person who was sent by Aramco, a Saudi man, sent by Aramco to train in the US, and he went to the movie theater in DC, and they didn't let him in. They were like, "You're not white." And he's like, "What?" Like, because in Saudi Arabia, he was hanging out with the, all these American white, like, just fine. Nobody told him you are not racially, like, you are racially different. And this is a very, this is an anecdote that someone is building a whole, body of work around of, like, how did the Gulf inherit these racial codes, but rather in labor context, because now in the Gulf, like, you see that people say the word racism even though they don't mean race, they mean nationality, and like, and there's a whole history of it because, like, there were all these bilateral agreements, labor agreements of, like, we get the teachers from Egypt, we get the domestic workers from Bangladesh, we get, and these agreements became patterns and norms and economies and so on. So now contemporary scholars, like, I don't know, I can remember Neha Vora and some junior scholars still working on this. I can't remember all the names, but are challenging this and saying, like, do we use the word racism, and, like, also in the context of the Arab Gulf, South Asians are seen as black, so, like, what do you call, like, what is this race, racialization, blackness as well? Is this blackness different from this one? Which legacies come with it, So I can go on with this, but, yeah, there are many examples, and I just, like, when digging into the Gulf, I felt like I can learn from critical race theory from the US, but it's very limited in this new context for me.
So I'm not going to ask each of the panelists when they started studying the Middle East, because I think it's going to be a difficult question for most of them. But tell us something that you wish you had known then that you think you or we know now about the region. And I'm going to put Raihan on the spot by making her go first.
I've been thinking about this, and it's not going to be easy for me to answer this question. I'm half Egyptian and half Malaysian. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to study the Middle East was because my father was a student at Al-Azhar University in the 70s. So he went to Egypt, studied at Al-Azhar. We've had this discussion earlier, came back with a wife, 2 kids. He was very productive with an Egyptian wife. But one thing was really fascinating is the Sunni-Shia divide. And for my father, who was a religious scholar, in the 1980s, there were Saudi clerics who came to Malaysia and trained religious scholars in Malaysia and told them the Shia were not Muslims. And I think that was when I was started to be really interested in the region, and I wanted to know more about the Sunni-Shia divide or Sunni-Shia relations. And that's when I really wanted to study religion and politics, because that's really my area of research. And for me, the more I learned, the more I realized I don't know much. And I think that's one thing about the region is just, the more you explore and the more you dig, the more you try and find information, the more you realize that there are just so many areas, so many angles that you still haven't explored. You just need to keep zooming in and you'll find diversity, and it's a region that is so vibrant, even when it comes to religious Sunni-Shia relations and so on. And I know Mohammed was talking about it earlier, how we're looking at the Syrian conflict, and Western or even media outlets in various parts of the world depicted it as a Sunni-Shia rivalry, so the Alawites versus Sunnis. And that's not really accurate at all. So you have Sunni-Shia intermarriage, and that was really common. I know in Bahrain, for example, you have Sunni-Shia intermarriage, and the kids are known as sushis, the children, as a result of the marriages. So again, it's a diversity and something that I hope anyone who's really interested in studying the region, it's just a beautiful region. I think there's so much to learn from. And I think I'm really glad to have this opportunity to be able to do that. Well,
your response began with Al-Azhar, the Center of Sunni Scholarship, which was founded as a Shia Hausa.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know. I would share a very personal lesson. I don't know how much it relates to others, but it took me years to realize this. But you can always find the past in the present, and this is something that I struggled to learn from Middle Eastern studies, it's very period divided, it's very, national divided, and it takes you years to make the connections, to even think that all of this was part of an empire, or a bunch of empires at least.
So I started working as an expert on, I wouldn't call me expert, but as an analyst of Middle Eastern economies in 1999 for a consulting firm. And I started applying basic economic theory that I understood to forecast the economic conditions of these countries. Now, when I look back, I wish I had spent more time studying the politics and sociology and culture of the region, because now I realize that the region is so complex that my analysis really wasn't accurate, because I did not have enough knowledge or understanding of these factors, and without them it's very hard to study the region. But I now know better.
Sure. So I started my university studies at Tehran University in journalism, and over the course of time I felt that it was not really satisfying. I was at the social sciences faculty in Tehran and had several programs including journalism and sociology, and after a couple of years, I became interested in sociology, and I found that really fascinating. I felt that that can explain what's happening in Iran and in the region. So I decided to pursue my first master's in sociology at Allama Tabatabai University in Tehran. And I became familiar with all the theories of the founding fathers of sociology, from Weber to Durkheim to Marx, and they were really fascinating. But over the course of time, I realized that what is the most important thing for understanding Iran and other Middle Eastern societies is history. I mean, we will learn all these theories that originate mostly in the Western context, and they don't mean to, and actually there are many Iranian scholars in Iran, they use those models and may be like grand theories to explain, for example, the revolution in Iran or the civil war in Lebanon. I think they are not usually very well in explaining what's happening in those contexts because they lack the knowledge of historians. So I think I wish I had become familiar with history and studied more of the history of Iran and the region early on. So that's what I think was the most important thing that I missed in my initial stage of university studies.
Thank you all. So I hope this evening has given you at least a taste of the scholars at this Crown Center, the sort of topics that are studied, and what the conversation's like, the interactions among the people at the Crown Center. I think you also got a sense of the range of positions that are at the Crown Center. We have permanent faculty at the Crown Center, such as Nader. We have one-year faculty leave fellows who are professors or scholars at other institutions here for 1 year. And then the junior research fellows, Mohammad and Mona, who are here for 2-year postdoc positions. So I encourage you to learn more about those opportunities, to join us at the Crown Center. They're available on the website. And also our future events. For the students, of course, there's classes being taught by the faculty at the Crown Center. I encourage you to look at the class offerings this year or next year. If you're not on our email list, sign up for our email list. Those of you on the stage, you're all YouTubers now because the Crown Center has a YouTube page. Oh, no. So if you're not one of the 13 people who subscribe to the channel, do so now. Let's get that number up to the 20s. And we have a wonderful set of events scheduled through the year. We have a series, our regular speaker series. We have other special events coming up, so make sure you're on our list. Check out the website. You'll see other events. You'll see our publications, the Middle East Brief Series, the Crown Conversations, and a number of other events that will be coming in publications throughout the year. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We have wonderful Middle Eastern fare in the back. For those of you online, sorry, we'll mail you some, but for those of you here, please join us in them. And before that, join me in thanking our fellows up here on the podium.
Thank you.